Coming up on New Day at Arirang, the mayor of the besieged Ukrainian city of Mariupol says 90% of it has been destroyed by Russia. He adds 130,000 people remain trapped in the city. Mariupol has been under siege from Russian forces for over a month now. Such aggression has been almost universally condemned by the international community. South Korea's new COVID-19 cases jumped to more than 260,000 on Tuesday, picking up from the previous day. However, the spread of Omicron has slowed after peaking out last month. Also, from today, oral COVID treatment medication will be available to more people. Plus, we have the latest on the trip to Washington by a delegation sent by South Korean President-elect Suk-yeol. Yoon's team call for a South Korea-US summit at an early date, since Yoon and Biden are determined to strengthen their alliance. The delegation also discusses the possible deployment of more US strategic assets to South Korea.
Hello and welcome to this Wednesday edition of New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. April 6th here in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Over the next hour, we will be taking a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world. We start, though, with the COVID-19 situation in South Korea. It seems the country has passed the worst of the Omicron surge. However, authorities aren't letting their guard down just yet.
As a matter of fact, officials are considering deploying a fourth round of COVID-19 shots from the fall. For more, our reporter Shin Yeon is here in the studio with us. Good morning, Yoon.
Good morning.
So let's start with a local tally for today. What are we expecting?
Sure, Mo-gyan, we're expecting to see today's caseload hover at around 290,000 because up to 9 p.m. Tuesday, 281,262 infections were already reported, and this was up by more than 21,000 from the same time a day ago. But compared to last week, the number of COVID-19 infections came down by over 132,000. Now, we've seen the average daily tally for COVID-19 hover in the 270,000s over the past week. This is a significant drop compared to last month when we saw this figure surpass 400,000. Naturally, with the drop in new infections, the number of people visiting residential treatment centers went down as well. These centers have been treating patients with mild COVID-19 symptoms. Now, as of now, only 19% of all residential treatment center hospital beds are occupied, and authorities are considering no longer running these centers as a whole, especially since they've shifted COVID-19 treatment methods to be more similar to treating the regular flu. From last November, most people infected with COVID-19 have been asked to recover at home, and recently authorities have allowed everyone to receive in-person treatment for COVID at local hospitals if they want to.
Right. Now, officials are fairly confident that we won't see a second Omicron mega surge like we've just endured, but they're not letting their guard down, and their main hope of stopping this happening is another round of vaccinations for people who want to get them, and this could be in the pipeline.
That's right, Mark. In a briefing on Tuesday, authorities said they are looking to secure millions more COVID-19 vaccines ahead of the fall and winter season when there may be a resurgence in infections due to drop in temperatures. That's why authorities are thinking of inoculating more of the population with a fourth vaccine shot. And other countries have already pressed ahead with giving out fourth jabs to vulnerable or elderly people. Israel, the first nation to make a fourth jab available in December of 2021, started an expanded rollout in January this year. In Hungary, fourth doses can be given to anyone who requests one after talking with a doctor or medical medical staff. And currently in Korea, fourth doses, or second boosters, if you'd like to call them, are being given out to those with weak immunity, seniors age 60 and up, and people at high-risk venues like nursing homes. But authorities have reiterated the importance of frequent vaccination, especially because of waning efficacy over time. And considering the limited shelf life of COVID-19 vaccines, authorities will need to get the timing right when it comes to bringing new shipments in. This comes as more than 2.3 million vaccines have had to be disposed of since February last year. And this is mainly because COVID-19 vaccines are mostly temperature sensitive and have a short shelf life. Moderna shots need to be stored in a refrigerator and can be used for only 30 days after a vial has been opened. And Pfizer shots have to be used within 31 days of them being defrosted and must be stored in a refrigerator as well.
Now, moving on to the treatment front. So we're looking ahead to more supplies. I mean, the antiviral pills.
That's right, Mogun. Now that the government has secured enough supply of oral treatments, they are making these antiviral pills more accessible. Some 420,000 courses of treatment are available for use this month. From today, nursing homes and mental health hospitals accounting for many cluster infections can receive antiviral pills from public health centers. And authorities have supplied public health centers nationwide with enough antiviral pills to immediately supply to other medical institutions and nursing hospitals in need. Each public health center will receive antiviral pills from Paxlovid. That's enough to treat 100 people, and from Lagevrio, enough to treat 24 people. Now, these centers can also request more supply if needed.
Let's hope such efforts could, even decrease the number of new infections. Yoon, thank you so much for your report.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, turning our focus to Russia's war against Ukraine, misery continues to mount for the people of Ukraine as Russian forces are maintaining their intense bombing campaigns across numerous key areas in that country.
The mayor of the Mariupol says 90% of the besieged city has been destroyed during the weeks Russian shells have relentlessly rained down the urban area. Many world leaders have reiterated their condemnation of Russia and called for urgent international support for the people of Ukraine. Lee Dae-hyun with this report.
Humanitarian issues have reached crisis point in Ukraine since Russia's invasion on February 24th. 90% of the Ukrainian southeast port city of Mariupol has reportedly been destroyed after being besieged by the Russian military. The city's mayor said on Monday in a press conference that 90% of the city's infrastructure is destroyed, while 40% is unrecoverable. He added that around 130,000 people remain trapped in the city without fuel and water, and the Ukrainian government is currently planning to evacuate the remaining residents. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said on Tuesday in a press conference ahead of Wednesday's NATO foreign ministers gathering in Brussels that Russia is likely to launch a new offensive in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region in the next several weeks.
We now see a significant movement of troops away from Kiev to regroup, rearm, and resupply, and they shift their focus to the east. In the coming weeks, we expect a further Russian push in the eastern and southern Ukraine to try to take the entire Donbas and to create a land bridge to occupied Crimea.
The Secretary General also highlighted the importance of NATO allies providing further support to Ukraine, including anti-tank weapons, air defense systems, and other equipment. Speaking to reporters before flying to Brussels for NATO and G7 meetings, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called Russian atrocities in Bucha a deliberate campaign to kill, to torture, to rape. He added that the reports out of Bucha are evidence for the world to see.
To make sure that one way or another, one day or another, there is accountability for those who committed these acts, for those who ordered them.
Blinken also said that countries around the world should make sure that they are doing everything they can to support Ukraine's fight to push out Russian aggression. Meanwhile, China addressed a UN Security Council session on Russia's invasion of Ukraine on Tuesday, and after seeing disturbing images from Bucha and other cities in Ukraine, said that the council should focus on verifying and establishing facts. China's ambassador to the UN said that dialogue and negotiations are the only route to peace and called on the US, NATO, and the EU to engage in comprehensive dialogue with Russia. However, he also added that humanitarian aid is necessary for Ukraine and promised to provide continuous assistance for the country. Lee Hyun, Arirang News.
South Korean delegates representing President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol visited the White House on Tuesday to discuss pending issues between the two allies. They also hand-delivered a letter from Yoon to President Joe Biden. Kim Hyo-sun with more.
South Korean President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's delegation to Washington has delivered a personal letter from Yoon for U.S. President Joe Biden. Representative Park Jin of the People Power Party, who's leading the team, said they handed the letter over Tuesday during their talks at the White House with U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. The two sides also discussed the need to hold a bilateral summit at an early date. But according to Park, no potential dates were mentioned. During the 40-minute-long meeting, they also touched upon the possible deployment of more U.S. strategic assets to South Korea. The lawmaker said this is an important part of Yoon's plan to strengthen Seoul's extended deterrence. In addition, Park said the letter includes Yoon's commitment to strengthen the South Korea-U.S. alliance so they can better respond to new challenges, including North Korea's nuclear threats and economic risks. North Korea policies were also discussed, with Seoul and Washington sharing the view that the regime's nuclear and missile activities pose a grave threat to the Korean peninsula and beyond. They also talked about ways to work together on other regional and global issues, namely climate change and solving supply chain disruptions. The delegation also met on Tuesday with the chairman of the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia to highlight the importance of bolstering the alliance. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
The chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff is warning that North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile programs pose a real threat to the U.S. homeland, as well as to Washington's allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific region. In a written testimony submitted to the U.S. House Committee on Armed Services before a budget hearing Tuesday, General Mark Milley also said the regime has no intent of giving up efforts to advance its military capabilities. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin also said the North presents, quote, persistent threats to the U.S. The official's remarks come as speculation rises that the North may be preparing its first nuclear test in years in the coming weeks.
The International Committee of the Red Cross is warning some 346 million Africans, more than a quarter of the continent's population, have an acute shortage of food. The organization cited the economic effects of the pandemic as many African countries are enduring conflict, drought, and rising prices for even basic food and fuel. It added humanitarian aid is being hampered due to inflation, which they say was triggered by Russia's war on Ukraine. South Korea's consumer prices last month rose more than 4%, the most in over a decade, mostly due to soaring commodity and energy prices. In a bid to lessen the burden on the public, the government on Tuesday announced that it's increasing the tax cut on fuel to 30% for at least 3 months, starting in May. Min Suk-yeol with the details.
South Korea's consumer prices are soaring. The consumer price index in March stood at 106, up 4.1% from a year ago. Consumer prices have seen on-year rises of more than 3% for 5 straight months since October last year, and now they've jumped more than 4% for the first time in over a decade. The last time inflation topped the 4% mark was in December 2011, when it hit 4.2%.
For most people, inflation is running far ahead of their income, making it harder for them to pay for their usual necessities like food, gas, and housing.
I drive a diesel car and believed it was fuel efficient, but now that the prices of diesel are as high as gasoline, I feel burdened by the price hikes.
Last month, gas prices were around 1,800 won, but they soon hit 2,000 won. So I'm a little afraid to buy fuel now. In the past, I didn't have that much of a problem with my expenses. But since everything is so costly, I feel like I have to earn more.
The country's skyrocketing inflation was mostly due to soaring energy prices amid the ongoing war in Ukraine. Prices of petroleum products were up more than 31% on year, accelerating from a 19% rise the previous month. Particularly, gasoline prices rose more than 27%, while diesel and LPG jumped by nearly 38% and 20% respectively. Seeking to curb inflation, the government has decided to give bigger tax cuts on fuel consumption. Starting in May, for 3 months, the government will slash fuel taxes by 30% from the current 20%. Over the next 3 months, it also plans to provide subsidies for freight trucks, buses, and cargo ships that have suffered from rising diesel prices. Going forward, inflation is expected to remain high. The Bank of Korea believes consumer prices will stay above 4% for the time being as crude oil, grain, and other commodity prices continue to rise. Attention is drawn to whether the central bank will further raise the benchmark interest rate in its upcoming Monetary Policy Board meeting next week. Min Suk-yeol, Arirang News.
Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. As we just heard there, South Korea's consumer prices soared at their fastest pace in more than 10 years last month, and analysts mostly blaming Russia's invasion of Ukraine for increasingly expensive energy and commodities. As we just heard in that report, a breakdown of the data provided on Tuesday showed prices at the pump surged more than 31%.
Yes, and as a result, the government will expand fuel tax cuts from the current 20% to 30% from early May through the end of July. The economic woes are also piling pressure on the Bank of Korea ahead of next week's rate-setting meeting. For more on the economic turmoil we're experiencing in South Korea, we connect to Oh Jun-seok, professor of economics at Suk-yeol University School of Business. Good morning, Professor Oh.
Good morning.
So firstly, on the government's decision to hike their fuel tax cuts to 30% for the next 3 months or so, in your opinion, was it the right decision? And will this have much an impact on us?
Yes, I suppose it was the right decision at the right timing, as less than expected. It would work. As a contingency plan to alleviate inflationary pressure, Korea will expand a tax cut on fuel consumption for the next 3 months at least, from the current 20% to 30%. This marks the largest tax cut ever applied to fuel consumption. The decision came as Korea's consumer price grew 4.1% in March from a year earlier, marking the fastest price growth in more than 10 years. In particular, the prices of oil-related products jumped 31.2%. Increasing price risks are caused by external factors mainly, including the crisis in Ukraine, higher inflation, and supply bottlenecks globally. Rising fuel prices have become a major concern, not only for retail consumers, but also for businesses, including commercial truckers. The Transportation Workers Union recently said the high diesel prices unfairly burden truck drivers because fuel expenses take more than 30% of transportation cost. The price of gas used at home for cooking and heating will be raised to 3%, while the price of gas used for a small business will be raised 1.3%. Though it will be temporary, I might say 30% of fuel tax cut would work well for the time being to lessen the burden of high inflation and moderate the velocity of consumer price in the market.
Okay, and at a meeting on Tuesday, South Korea's finance minister came out and said the issue of inflation is the most important and graver than any other pending economic issue in South Korea right now. Do you agree with that statement? And what, if anything, can policymakers here to try and do to reduce its impact?
Big yes, at the moment, I agree. Complex inflation, combination of cost push and demand pull altogether are attacking our economy like a perfect storm. Consumer price grew more than 4% in Korea for the first time in more than 10 years in March, as energy price jumped amid Russia's invasion. Another gauge of core inflation, which excludes highly volatile prices of agricultural and petroleum products, gained 3.3%. It is the fastest climb since December 2011. As inflation pressure has built up due to the extension of the economic recovery momentum, the Bank of Korea expressed concern that inflation will be under more upward pressure going forward. This might be interpreted as the central bank start to be widely expected to continue tightening its money supply in the coming months to tame inflation. Monetary policy is not that enough. In addition to monetary tightening, it is also expected to counter rising costs, especially stabilizing raw material prices in the sourcing market. It might be needed as a policy option for the government to apply 0% of the tariff quota on such raw materials as aluminum strips, casting alloy used to produce secondary battery in automobiles, while securing additional supplies of wheat and corn through the alternative supply chains.
Now, Professor, inflation is putting a lot of pressure on the Bank of Korea to raise its benchmark interest rate even higher. In fact, they have to make that decision in the absence of the governor. So do you think that the BOK would hike rates next week? And what about the rest of the year?
Not likely to increase rate next week, but I suppose they will hike interest rate in May. A cautious but repetitive adjustment one by one, I mean that by 25 basis points would be forecast to the end of this year, depending upon the market movement changes. Since the consumer price inflation is projected to continue to the end of this year. Additionally, global supply bottlenecks, rises in energy and raw material prices are expected to push Korea's cost inflation higher than last year. It is true, in part, in the transition period of the COVID-19 pandemic into endemic, the Korean economy is forecast to continue its sound growth, supported by reopening of global economic activity and easing of domestic social distancing regulations. But there is a theory telling that interest rate gap between major trade partners should be kept. This means, in accordance with the interest rate decision of the U.S. Fed, Bank of Korea will stabilize the interest rate gap to restore the balance by increasing the rate. Depending upon the decision of the U.S. Fed, the Bank of Korea will increase interest rate. As a result, foreign exchange rate volatility will be widened in the foreign exchange market. In brief, it is projected while the goods market restores to the normalcy, financial market can hardly keep on their cruising direction to the rest of the year, surrounded by a chain of uncertainties.
Okay, as everyone's aware, here in South Korea, we're on the cusp of a new government. If you were advising President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's transition team on how to cope with soaring energy prices and inflation, what would you suggest?
Yeah, more than anything else, inflation. Inflation is the top priority. But if I got a chance, I'd like three things to count in. First, monitoring financial market will be of greater importance, in part to deciding and implementing tools for fiscal policy, in part to deciding the diplomatic policy. It is needed. Korean stock price will be expected to fluctuate depending upon the decision making for the time being, and the discount rate will be soared up in the both markets. So, in this sense, financial market monitoring should be needed. And secondly, a supply chain bottleneck of raw material and energy will become larger burden to the rest of the year. It is also needed from the risk management perspective to prepare for a supply chain monitoring system or early warning system globally among major industry to hold on the supply disruption. And lastly, energy diplomacy with the Middle East region in the frame of Korea and GCC FTA negotiation would be started. And then I might say that as a policy priority should be set on this kind of energy resource diplomacy.
All right, let's hope these suggestions could be heard by the incoming government. Professor, thank you so much for your insights as always.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
South Korea's Blue House says there will be an extraordinary cabinet meeting on Wednesday to approve the funds needed to relocate the presidential office as requested by President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol. The Moon-jae administration has agreed to cooperate with this request from the incoming government, which wants to move the top office to central Seoul. Our Yoon Jung-min reports.
The cabinet is set to hold an extraordinary meeting on Wednesday to approve funds needed to relocate the presidential office, as requested by President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol. Yoon has been pushing to move the office to the building now used by the Defense Ministry in Yongsan-gu district. The meeting was ordered on Tuesday by President Moon Jae-in, according to the Blue House spokesperson.
President Moon Jae-in was briefed this morning on the government review of funding reserved for the relocation of the presidential office, and he ordered an extraordinary cabinet meeting as soon as possible to give the approval.
The Blue House had earlier raised security concerns about the relocation, but President Moon agreed last week to cooperate on the matter when he met President-elect Yoon for dinner. Yoon's spokesperson said Tuesday that cooperation on the issue is going well.
After the dinner between President Moon Jae-in and President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol, cooperation is well underway in a broad framework.
Officials at the Blue House added that they will continue to coordinate on security issues. The government is reportedly planning to approve the reserve funds worth some $29 million for the first batch, though details were not given on exactly how much. Earlier, Yoon has suggested the relocation would cost some $41 million. Sources say that for security reasons, the budget will not include the cost of relocating Defense Ministry offices related to the South Korea-U.S. joint military exercises to be held this month. The funds do, however, reportedly include the cost of remodeling the official residence of the Army Chief of Staff into a new presidential residence. It remains to be seen whether there will be additional funds approved to cover the rest of the costs. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Now it's time for us to cross over to our OCR for Global Insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Mark. It's time for Global Insight. The ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia entered its sixth week, even as talks are underway between the two sides to come to an agreement to end the fighting. The devastation on human lives and livelihoods is growing by the day, but many fear that Russian leader Vladimir Putin has no intention of calling it quits. We discussed the latest developments with Maya Cross, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Northeastern University, and Christopher Hartwell, Professor at the Saar University of Management and Law in Zurich. Thank you both so much for joining us today. My first question to you, Professor Cross. Now, you've said that the war in Ukraine is likely to end in one of the three ways: a protracted Cold War, a possible World War III, or a nuclear war. Now, at this point, which of the scenarios looks most likely to you?
Right now, I would say it's actually headed more towards a protracted Cold War, and this would be perhaps the best outcome that we could foresee at the moment. I think the reason that it's looking more like that rather than a broader European or world war is because the Russian troops have really reached the limit of what they can do. They've had to retrench. We've seen them back down from trying to take Kyiv and topple the government. It seems that their goal now is more limited to eastern Ukraine and the Donbass region. And meanwhile, the sanctions are really hurting the Russian economy. So I think that the goals are more limited. But at the same time, the risk still exists that it could grow into something bigger. I think what worries me is that Putin may feel more desperate as he's not able to sort of chalk up the wins that he initially had intended. And if that's the case, there could be some kind of use of more powerful weapons. Another scenario is the risk of accident or miscalculation, where a missile from the Russian forces ends up crossing over into NATO territory. And if something like that happens, especially considering there's been a kind of decline in diplomatic interaction, there's less communication, particularly between the US and Russia, we could see this kind of misperception, miscalculation, which then grows into a broader war that brings NATO countries into it. And then we're talking about countries that have nuclear weapons, so nuclear powers in conflict with one another, potentially leading to World War III and a nuclear conflict. Still, at the moment, I think we are headed more into something that looks more like a protracted Cold War, though.
And Professor Hartwell, more than 300 people have been killed and tortured in Bucha, according to reports. And the death toll is, of course, expected to be much higher once the entire city has been checked. And, well, the devastation seems to be growing and growing very terribly. And, well, do you think NATO is ever going to intervene in the Ukraine conflict at some point?
Well, I think what we see is the ante has been upped for NATO. It's going to be very, very difficult for NATO to sit on the sidelines now, given the atrocities that we've seen and the fact that these are only the tip of the iceberg, the fact that these are only the areas that the Ukrainian army has reclaimed. We don't know what's going on in Kherson. We don't know what's going on in Mariupol. We have pretty good sense now of what's going on. But whether or not this is some form of tripwire, some kind of red line, as former U.S. President Barack Obama said, I don't think it's going to rise to that level for NATO because the same issues are still there in terms of confronting a nuclear armed and possibly irrational actor. I think what we're going to see, perhaps, we see it with the Czechs already, is more under the table arming of the Ukrainians. As I say, the Czechs are sending T-72 tanks. Perhaps the United States is in talks with Cyprus right now to send Soviet-era weaponry to Ukraine. Maybe we're going to see a stiffening of resolve, but I don't think we're going to see much more other than kind of expressions of condemnation, horrific actions, kicking Russia off the UN Human Rights Council. Again, more kind of symbolic actions. We will possibly see things that are happening again under the table, but we're not going to see anything overt for the reasons that Professor Cross already outlined.
And again, Professor Hartwell, well, the US has said that Russian President Putin is being misled by advisors who are, at this point, too scared to tell him the truth. Do you think that's true? And what do you think is really running through his mind?
Well, there's two things going on here. The first one is the old canard that if only Putin knew what was going on, he's being misled. He's not getting all the information. I'm sure he's a reasonable person if only he knew what was going on. We've been hearing this one from Kremlinologists forever, which is why I will not hazard a guess as to what is going on in Putin's mind. On the other hand, there is a small grain of truth to this, I would say, in the sense that Putin has actively eliminated opposition and other power poles within the Kremlin over the past 20 years. He's emasculated anyone else who's tried to step up to him, like Medvedev, during his brief period as president. So I don't think he's actually getting all the information. He's probably... he's definitely convinced of his own press. The hubris is there, as you could see from the strategy and the tactics of the Russian army going into Ukraine. He believed that this was going to be a 15-day war. He's not getting all the information he needs, probably because people are scared of feeding it to him, but it doesn't matter. He's still the commander-in-chief. He's still the executive. He's still the person who is making these decisions based on his own hubris and his own imperialistic ideology, so it doesn't matter.
And Professor Cross, do you think President Putin has any intention of ending this war at all, or signing and sticking to a peace deal? I mean, what do you think he wants to really get out of this first?
Well, I think he really has to be able to claim a win in some way. And by that, I mean both on the battlefield and geopolitically. So I think we have to remember that his key aim as the leader of Russia is to stay in power. He needs popular support to some degree at home to do this. But he's not going to voluntarily end the war unless he feels he can claim that he's won, so he can sell it at home and extend the reign of his power. The problem is at the moment, it's likely he can't truly win unless Ukraine is destroyed, in his view. And if we really look at what's gone on in the past few weeks, in many ways, he's already lost. So many of his decisions have really been self-defeating. He wanted to show strength, but instead he's revealed significant weaknesses in his power and in Russia's military power. We expected him to try to divide the West and to undermine liberal values, but in fact, the opposite has happened. The Western alliances have proven strong. There are ways in which everyone's speaking with one voice across the world, condemning what Putin has done in Ukraine. He wants to push Ukraine away from democracy and aspirations that lead it towards Western alliances. The opposite is happening. And he's not able to do basic things like stop the flow of weapons from the West into Ukraine, to stop the tens of thousands of Russian casualties. So in effect, he's found his country isolated. And in terms of peace talks, I think at this point we can't really take the Russian delegation very seriously. Putin himself hasn't really become involved in the peace talks directly. There are two things on the table that he wants of Ukraine, two major things at least. One is that Ukraine will promise not to join NATO, so-called neutrality. And the other is that Ukraine should have to give up some of its territory to Russia. So he wants at least these two things. But the whole problem with this is that the Ukrainian people are fighting to stop this Russian invasion precisely because they're not willing to give up those two things. So hopefully, we won't see Ukraine effectively surrender to Russia, despite all of the hardships and atrocities we're seeing at the moment.
And Professor Cross, there's been quite a lot of talk about Ukrainian neutrality, which seems like it will have to be part of whatever peace deal is reached by the two sides. But will that really bring peace? I mean, given Putin's lack of commitment to respecting past agreements on borders, what kind of security guarantee do you think Kyiv is really going to need?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. And as we all know, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has actually offered neutrality at this point. But the thing is that it would only, even if it's accepted, it would only last for a very short period of time. Zelensky has said that in order to grant neutrality, Russian troops would first have to withdraw. So that would give some kind of window of peace. But right after that, I don't think that peace would hold. The Ukrainian people wouldn't accept it, for one thing. Again, they've already died for self-determination and for sovereignty. Their cities and towns have been destroyed for it. So neutrality is really only in a short-term solution. And again, it represents a kind of surrender. But in order to make neutrality work, as you said, there has to be security guarantees. These security guarantees would necessitate other countries guaranteeing Ukrainian security for it, because part of the demand of Russia would be to demilitarize Ukraine, making it unable to participate in any foreign policy of its own or to protect itself. So what you have at the end would be something akin to a parallel form of Article 5, that an attack on Ukraine brings in other countries, probably NATO countries, again exposing this whole region to the possibility of a larger war, to World War III. And at the end of the day, I don't think you can trust Putin to stay committed to any kind of peace deal anyway. So I think if Ukraine actually gives in to this and agrees to neutrality, there is the possibility that Putin, instead of kind of backing down, will become emboldened to get a similar outcome with other countries to try to dominate them as well, particularly the Baltic countries.
And Professor Hartwell, at this point, it seems critical that the deaths and atrocities, devastation comes to a stop. And well, how should a very quick peace deal then be rolled out?
I don't think there is a quick peace deal. I think Professor Cross said it exactly right. The Russians have proven themselves to be disingenuous when it comes to their negotiations. We've seen this time and again. The Russians utilize these peace talks, these ceasefires, in an attempt to kind of regroup and retrench, and then once again to negotiate in terms of offering demands and forcing other countries to do things from a position of strength. They're not getting anywhere when it comes to peace talks now, even with this idea of neutrality, which, of course, Ukraine was neutral in 2014 when Russia invaded the first time. There were security guarantees on the table from the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which they blitzed right through. So none of these things are going to happen again. I think with every step, and especially now the atrocities, now we know what is happening in Ruski Mir, in Russian world. We know what's happening behind the curtain in the occupied territories in Ukraine, that there is no quick peace deal. There is only victory. And it is only people who are outside of the war zone or who are on the Russian side who are talking about peace deals. The Ukrainians themselves are talking about victory when we win this war.
What are your thoughts on this, Professor Cross? I mean, the human cost of this war is simply unbearable. Is there a best or fast way to end it? I mean, what kind of developments are you hoping to see in this regard?
Well, it's a really tough one because essentially the war likely has to end in order to stop this human cost. And as we've seen, and as Professor Hartwell already mentioned, Ukrainians are fighting for victory here. They've already made a lot of sacrifices. And so they're bearing the human cost of it. I think the EU should continue to have an open door to refugees, but there has to be a recognition globally that there's a limit to what the EU can do in this respect, especially with such an unprecedented fast flow of refugees in a short period of time. Other countries should take more refugees. Hopefully there's a way to negotiate more reliable humanitarian corridors so people can get to safety. But again, the best way to stop the human cost is to end the war itself. And I think the West is doing what it can. It has to continue to ratchet up the sanctions at their fullest to start really sanctioning energy, because otherwise money keeps flowing into Russia. There has to be an increase in the transfer of weapons to Ukraine. The Western alliances have to hold strong. The world has to speak with one voice in condemning what's going on there. And hopefully that will eventually bring an end to the war.
That was Maya Cross, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Northeastern University, and Christopher Hartwell, Professor at Saul School of Management and Law. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you.
There are around 250,000 taxis operating nationwide in South Korea. Most are regular cabs that take you from A to B, but some are a little different. They include the so-called quiet taxis that are operated by drivers that are deaf. Our Song Yoo-jin went to check them out and files us this report.
It's been over 2 years since Lee Hyung-soo started working as a taxi driver. But not long before that, Lee couldn't have imagined himself driving a taxi. For deaf people like him, finding a job in the service industry where communication is crucial has not been easy. Then in 2018, a startup company launched a taxi service linking the deaf to taxi companies. 2 years later, the service transformed to a ride-hailing platform called 고요하nem.
We started 고요하nem hoping to offer higher wages and more job opportunities to the disabled, particularly the deaf. So far, we have created 115 jobs, with 41 drivers currently operating 23 taxis.
And I had the chance to ride one of these special taxis.
Passengers who want to take this taxi can call the driver by entering where they will get on and off using this application called 고요하nem.
The app then matches a nearby driver. Thanks to a tablet PC attached behind the passenger seat, communicating with the driver is not a problem. Passengers record what they want to say, then the recording is sent to the driver's tablet PC.
조금만 천천히 가주세요.
The driver can also reply through his own device.
This tablet PC not only allows passengers to communicate with the driver, but also teaches basic sign language, like thank you and you're such a great driver.
All of the platform's taxis are SUVs to give drivers a clear view of the road while offering passengers a spacious and comfortable ride. The company is now working towards a bigger goal.
We are looking to enhance mobility for the disabled. For one, we have brought over a wheelchair-friendly taxi from the UK. Our ultimate goal is to provide a mobility service that is open to all drivers and passengers with or without a disability.
Lee hopes 고요한M and similar services will keep improving opportunities for the disabled.
특히나 이제 저 같은 농아인분들은 일자리를 구하기가 많이 어렵습니다. 그래서 일자리가 앞으로 확대되었으면 좋겠고, 특히나 이제 농아인이긴 하지만 승객들에게 친절하게 서비스를 제공해드리고 싶습니다.
That service, along with privacy and comfort, is why more people are turning to these quiet taxis. 송유진, 아리랑 뉴스.
And now for a look at news from around the world, we turn to our Ising Jae, who's joining us at our Arirang newsroom. Good morning.
Good morning to you guys.
So, Sunja, let's start off in Sri Lanka, where people have been taking to the streets in the past few days to protest against government mishandlings that have led to an economic crisis.
That's right. So hundreds of protesters continue to demonstrate out on the streets of the capital, Colombo, as university students chanted anti-government slogans and waved place cards calling on the country's president to go home or simply resign. Now, the demonstration comes as ruling party lost its majority in the parliament after more than 40 lawmakers walked out of the ruling coalition on Tuesday. The country's finance minister also resigned the day after his appointment and ahead of a crucial loan program talks scheduled with the IMF. Now, the Sri Lankans have been protesting against food and fuel shortages triggered by a lack of foreign exchange reserve for imports. The demonstrations have intensified in the recent days, leading to clashes between protesters and police. Now, protests have also been rampant in Peru's capital as well, leading to the country's president imposing curfew in Lima on Tuesday, banning people from leaving their homes in an attempt to curb demonstrations against rising fuel and fertilizer costs. Now, the protests have continued into their second week while the government scrambles to bring prices down. The government also says the protests have been increasingly violent, as at least 4 people have been killed since they began. The mass public outcry comes on the heels of President Castillo surviving a second impeachment attempt just 8 months into his presidency. Now, in some brighter news, golf fans around the world are excited as Tiger Woods announced Tuesday that he's going to be competing at the Masters this week. The 5-time Masters champion's highly anticipated return to competition comes after he suffered a car crash last year that nearly resulted in doctors amputating his right leg. Now, he hasn't competed on the PGA Tour since November 2020, but now looks to add to his impressive trophy haul. The 5-time Masters winner will tee off Thursday morning at Augusta National. And finally, British auction house Christie's announced it will soon be listing a previously unknown drawing by Michelangelo that they expect could fetch over $32 million. Now, the drawing is thought to be one of Michelangelo's early works dating to the end of the 15th century. While the work had been designated a French national treasure and was barred from being exported from the country for 30 months, the French government recently removed the designation, allowing the art piece to be offered to collectors anywhere in the world. The drawing will be exhibited in Hong Kong and New York before being auctioned in Paris in May.
Good morning. It's shaping up to be another nice spring day under bright skies, and morning temperatures are about 3 degrees higher than the same time yesterday. Well, air quality has improved, but the capital and Chungcheong-do provinces could see bad air in the morning. But also the air is getting drier, and dry weather alerts have been issued across inland regions, and that's including here in the capital. Meanwhile, wildfire danger levels are very high. At this level, fires could start easily. Morning temperatures are a few notches higher this morning, 12 degrees in Daegu and Busan. Highs will rise quickly under sunny skies today, and Seoul will be going up to 16 degrees. Daejeon topping out at 20. Daegu will be as warm as yesterday at 22. Well, morning rain is in the forecast in the west of central regions and Jeollado tomorrow, although the amount will not be much to help relieve the dryness in the air. Then it will only get warmer, topping out at 23 degrees by Sunday here in the capital. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that's all we have for now. We appreciate you tuning in. I'm Kim Mo-kyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Thank you as always for joining us. Until next time, goodbye.